Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. If you'd like to help support the show and listen to over a dozen supporter-only episodes, you can join me on patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris or subscribe through Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thanks for being here. Now let's get started. What does it mean to be modern? It's a deceptively simple question. For most of us, modernity evokes contemporary technology, cultural liberalism, economic dynamism. But in historical terms, modern doesn't just mean recent. It's a conceptual break. In the historiographic tradition, modernity is best understood not as a period, but as an idea, a worldview rooted in the belief that the future can and should be better than the past. While academic disciplines differ in how they define modernity, some privileging political systems, others science or economics, they all converge on a central theme: that modernity is historically distinguished by its emphasis on progress. As the historian Peter J. Taylor summarized it well, quote, "The idea of something being modern is that it does what it does better than what it replaces," end quote. Modernity's promise, in theory, is a better life for ordinary people. But modernity has expressed that promise primarily through material growth. In theory, progress might be measured in justice, knowledge, or freedom, but in practice, it has been measured in output. It has meant more production, more comfort, more convenience. Especially in America, modernity became almost indistinguishable from consumption. The pursuit of happiness has become mostly a pursuit of things. By the 20th century, liberty and democracy found their clearest expression not in civic participation, but in consumer choice. As historian Gary Cross put it, quote, "The understanding of self in society through goods provided a more dynamic and popular ideology of public life than most political belief systems." End quote. This was not simply a cultural preference. It was the logic of a civilization founded on momentum. To stand still in the modern world is to fall behind. Growth is not just a goal, it's a requirement. We measure national well-being by GDP and personal success by acquisition. And this is not merely sped up life, it's redefined it. Since the Industrial Revolution, global energy consumption has increased by a factor of nearly 100. In less than a century, we've used more resources than in all of prior human history combined. Of course, we know there is something fundamentally unsustainable about this paradigm. It's too volatile. We live in a world hurtling toward the future with such velocity that even the word acceleration feels too gentle. Progress is now measured not in centuries or decades, but in quarters, in updates, in new releases. We're moved to make up terms that attempt to define the historical event horizon we're racing toward in an effort to orient ourselves to an increasingly alien future, terms like singularity and superintelligence. And yet, for all the wonder terms like that evoke, there is indeed something increasingly disturbing about it. What it means to be human is no longer stable. So, I find myself wondering more and more these days. Was there ever a time in our species' past when things were truly stable? A time when human beings lived in deep alignment with their biology, their culture, and their environment, not for a few decades, but for hundreds of generations. A time when what it meant to be human meant to be something exquisitely well-matched to the world as it was. Not only did such a time exist, it constitutes the longest stretch of our species' time on Earth. Today, I want us to journey back to a special part of that primeval period, an epoch between 22,000 and 28,000 years ago, when a people called the Cro-Magnon thrived across Ice Age Europe. The name Cro-Magnon comes from a limestone rock shelter in southwestern France, Abri de Cro-Magnon, where the first remains of these early modern humans were discovered in 1868. These people were us, not some hunched, primitive humanoid. They were anatomically modern Homo sapiens, genetically indistinguishable from ourselves. But what makes them so astonishing is that they lived in a world that was stable across hundreds of generations. And they were, in many ways we'll discuss, more fully human than we are now. This episode is about that long-forgotten equilibrium, about the people we were before history began, about what it meant to be alive when our species had reached, perhaps for the first and only time, a kind of evolutionary glide. When you hear the phrase 250 generations, you might think of a dizzying sprawl of time. That's how many generations stand between us and the first city, Uruk, located in ancient Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq, between us and the invention of writing, between us and the origin of kings. 250 generations ago, human beings were etching the first symbols into clay tablets, and now we're training artificial intelligence to simulate consciousness. The scale of change is overwhelming. But here's the thing. That same number of generations, 250, passed in the span between 28,000 and 22,000 years ago, and in that window, nothing changed. At least, not in the way we understand change. A Cro-Magnon child born 28,000 years ago would have grown up, lived, loved, raised children, and died in a world essentially identical to that of her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter thousands of years later. Same landscape, same tools, same hunting grounds, same stories, same songs. That's not stagnation. That's equilibrium. It's what happened when our species found a niche so well suited to our biology and knowledge that innovation, such as it was a form of subtle refinement, not revolution, and this made the Cro-Magnon people masters of their world. That world would be almost unrecognizable to us today. Europe at the time was far colder and wilder, shaped by the Ice Age climate that dominated then. Towering glaciers rimmed the northern horizon, with expansive, fertile steppes stretching for hundreds of miles south across much of the continent, interspersed with deep pockets of ancient forest and cut through by pristine glacial rivers. This habitat nourished vast herds of reindeer, aurochs, wild horses, woolly mammoths, and bison that roamed among the grasslands and forests in numbers that would boggle our minds. These herds attracted not only human hunters, but lions significantly larger than modern African lions, along with dire wolves and ice-age leopards. Giant bears slumbered in the same caves where humans might seek shelter from the blizzards that regularly raked over the land. Without a trace of pollution and air that was often much drier from the cold, the night sky was so brilliant with stars that constellations we've long forgotten likely shaped Cro-Magnon myths and navigational methods. This wasn't wilderness as we romanticize it. It was indifferent and immense, with no refuge but what you built with your bare hands. Next, let's imagine an average Cro-Magnon man who lived in that wildness. At 30 years old, He stands just under 6 feet tall, slightly taller than the average adult male height today, with a broad chest and strong, well-muscled limbs. He has denser bones, perhaps up to 10% more mineralized than ours, and stronger tendons with greater muscle attachment sites. He's a beast with a more robust frame overall. His face was broader and his jaw stronger, shaped by the lifelong work of chewing tough, fibrous foods: dried meat, roasted roots, sinew, and raw plant stalks. His dental arch was wider than ours, with room for all 32 teeth to erupt and function properly. Malocclusion, impacted wisdom teeth, and crowded jaws, the dental hallmarks of modern life, were virtually non-existent then. This man's teeth were somewhat worn down with use, but not rotted. This isn't the result of better hygiene, but of a fundamentally different diet: unprocessed, unsweetened, and mechanically demanding. His grip strength, developed through years of toolmaking and hauling game, likely rivals that of an elite modern rock climber. His lungs are vast, trained over his lifetime for endurance hunting over miles of uneven terrain. He has slightly larger eyes than we do, and his vision is likely more sensitive than ours to dusk, firelight, and the dim interiors of caves and forests. His hearing is better than practically anyone's alive today, having never been dulled by the commotion of city traffic, the assault of headphones, or the motorized scream of home appliances. But it's not just the audio physiology, it's the neurology of his hearing that's different, fine-tuned over a lifetime of meditative concentration needed to distinguish between the rustle of prey and the whisper of wind. His sense of smell, likewise, is far more crucial than we tend to imagine among human beings, trained to track subtle shifts in weather or the approach of a rival tribe. His brain is just as large as ours, perhaps even slightly larger, and not a lobe wasted. It holds the migration patterns of herd animals, the seasonal rhythms of plants, the medicinal uses of roots and fungi, the rituals of his ancestors, the vocal mimicry of birds, the grain of every tree, the exact way to shape a flint core into a spearhead that will not shatter on impact. He can sing and laugh and grieve. He can tell stories with multiple characters and shifting timelines. He can navigate by starlight, preserve meat with smoke, and read the landscape like a text. This is no caveman. This is a survival genius. The renowned archaeologist and anthropologist Brian Fagan, in his book Cro-Magnon, How the Ice Age Gave Birth to the First Modern Humans, describes how these people lived not just with survival in mind, but with art, ornament, and meaning woven into the everyday. They wore sewn clothing made from reindeer hides and lined with fur. They decorated themselves with necklaces of bone, shell, and ivory. They buried their dead with ochre and antlers and tools, gestures that communicated symbolic thought and a rich spiritual imagination. Their tools were elegant. They crafted razor-sharp blades from flint, bone needles with eyes for threading sinew, barbed harpoons from reindeer antlers, and a range of compound tools, hafted implements combining multiple materials shaped through heat and friction. They painted animals with astonishing realism in deep cave sanctuaries like Lascaux and Chauvet, preserving their cosmology not in writing, but in pigment and firelight. They were musical, crafting flutes from bird bones and ivory, the earliest instruments ever found. But perhaps most impressive is the fact that all of this lasted unchanged for millennia. Why? Because in a world where your life depends on the accumulation of ecological wisdom, nothing is more dangerous than disruption. In their world, a new way of doing something wasn't better, Generation after generation, each person inherited a world they already understood deeply. What they did just worked. Imagine the cultural memory this created. Imagine what it meant to sit by a fire, hearing a story that your ancestors had passed down for so long that everyone assumed it began with the world itself, having no quantitative concept of centuries or millennia, and knowing it still applied after all that time. Imagine not just respecting your elders, but realizing they carried knowledge as essential as water or meat. Imagine a 10-year-old who could name the stars, gut a rabbit, mimic bird calls, and track footprints in the snow. Imagine how dense each human life had to be with skill, attention, and memory. In that sense, Cro-Magnon people may have been more complete than we are, not in our moral frameworks or technological power, but in how fully they engaged every part of the human sensorium. Of course, life was hard. Infant mortality was high. Injuries could be fatal. Winters were brutal. But hardship was part of the enduring pattern, and they passed their mastery of that pattern down across the millennia, practically unchanged, without ever writing a word. That's surely a high water mark of human intelligence. So, what brought that stability to an end? Some say climate change or overhunting of megafauna. Others, population pressure, which emerged in tandem with the rise of agriculture. It was likely the outcome of a slow but inexorable accretion of people's attempts to gain some measure of control over their fate. The truth is, no single cause explains the great rupture in our species' history between the time of stasis and the time of unceasing and volatile change. But by 12,000 years ago, a different pattern had definitively emerged: sedentarism, domestication, and surplus. And from surplus came hierarchies, and then cities. Civilization, in other words, and with it, the permanent loss of that ancient equilibrium. Scholars like Jared Diamond have provocatively argued that the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago was, quote, the worst mistake in the history of the human race, end quote. Not because it didn't yield benefits, but because of the hidden costs. It introduced inequality and infectious disease. Hunter-gatherers like the Cro-Magnon ate more varied diets and lived in more egalitarian bands. Farming locked us into rigid hierarchies of land, property, and state. Civilization gained power, but the individual lost autonomy. And now here we are, 250 generations into that new epoch. What are we to make of such a remarkable shift in our fortunes? It's very tempting to romanticize the deep past, to imagine the Cro-Magnon world as noble and unspoiled. But that's not totally fair. Their lives were incredibly difficult. Violence, predation, exposure, infanticide, starvation, all were familiar dangers. Civilization, for all its chaos and compromise, emerged in large part as a hedge against those very vulnerabilities. The shift from the wilderness to the walled city is not just a historical event, it's a human decision. And for many, especially those with children, it felt like the only decision. Because when the stakes are the survival of your offspring, you choose security. You choose the granary over the forest, the schoolhouse over the cave, the hospital over the healer, the rule of law over the rhythms of tribe and ritual. You choose the world in which your child is, at least in theory, less vulnerable to predation, starvation, and enemy violence. As the philosopher John Stuart Mill once noted, civilization may come at the cost of vigorous individual character, but it offers peace, And parents, more than anyone, understand the value of peace. That's the essential trade off of civilization. We get surplus and safety, but we give up something more elemental and spiritually nourishing. We traded the life of the hunter gatherer, which was beautiful but dangerous, for the life of a citizen consumer, which is comfortable but vapid. But again, most parents faced with that trade off instinctively choose the latter, the one where their children aren't so vulnerable to the savagery of nature. And yet, we surrender so much in the bargain that we can't help but look back, not with envy, perhaps, but with reverence, to wonder about those long ago who never had that choice, and so were compelled to live in a world when we were most human. I'm Brad Harris. So long.